Okay, we're using Screencastify to record my beautiful voice. We're reading the medieval period from the Anthology. So if you go to classwork, see if I can find it. Go to the classwork tab. You'll notice that it has two files, the one that you annotate and the one that you take notes on. So open them both up. One's going to end up looking like this. That's the Anthology. Other one's going to look like that. All right. I'll see if I can open them both at the same time. Both sort of open on my screen. There we go. Let me open this with Candy already. Oh, it opens in a different window. Okay, so here we go. The medieval period, the Norman conquest. Turn on some kind of a tool for marking it up. This is a PDF, so the markup might become different than if you were using a document that had text. So the first section we're going to read is the Norman conquest. I should probably make a separate file anyway. The official history of the medieval period begins with 1066 with the Battle of Hastings, in which Harold, the King of England, was defeated by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. William invaded England to support his claim that he had been promised the succession to the English throne. The coming of the Normans to England was not another hit-and-run raid, but a full-fledged invasion and occupation. The occupation was imposed systematically and can be described in modern terms. There was an inventory and a seizure of property. Martial law was put into effect. A strong central government was set up with lines of authority clearly defined. William was an efficient and ruthless soldier and able administrator. With his followers, many of whom were adventurers and soldiers of fortune, he was soon able to conquer the whole country. He reigned for 21 years, and the succession was assured at his death. Okay, so what we've got is the official part of the medieval period begins in 1066, and this guy, Harold, gets defeated by William the Conqueror. Okay, so the English guy gets defeated by William the Conqueror, who's the Duke of Normandy, which is now in France. So the French guy comes over, defeats the English guy, takes over, and he stays. He takes an inventory, he seizes all property, he imposes law, okay, and he rules with a new administration, which ends up sort of making its mark on history, because now the country is no longer a violent place. It's actually being ruled by law. Okay, the Normans, a name derived from Northman, were in large part descended from the Vikings who had seized and then remained in northwestern France, which became known as Normandy. After more than 100 years in France, the Normans had adopted, I'm going to push this over a bit if I can, had adopted many French customs and had their own variation of the French language, Norman French. They were a curious people, superb soldiers, excellent administrators and lawyers, great borrowers and adapters, but lacking inventiveness and original ideas. Even the architecture and the ambitious building in stone that they introduced into England originated in northern Italy. It used to be assumed that the Norman conquerors civilized the defeated Anglo-Saxons, but in some respects, notably in their more democratic system of government and in their crafts and designs, the Anglo-Saxons were more advanced than the Normans. William was able to subdue the whole land partly because he could adopt and use the institution of highly centralized and stable Anglo-Saxon government. The dual kingdoms of England and Normandy established by William became the most powerful force in Europe. William's descendants greatly increased their land holdings in Europe, either through marriage or by conquest. The Norman kings of England spent much of their time across the English Channel fighting for their French territories and later administering their continental kingdoms. The court, of course, accompanied the king. It is a tribute to the stability of their kingdom and its management that one of its kings, Richard the Lionhearted, could spend all but 5 months of his 10 years' reign outside of his English kingdom. Okay, this is happening all through Europe. That everybody's trying to increase their land holdings. They're trying to get more land. Okay, they're marrying other people who have land. Oops, stop that. Don't do that. They're marrying other people who have land. There we go. Okay, or they're stealing it from other people. They're fighting for it. Okay, and slowly but surely, all of these kings are gathering up kingdoms and land all through Europe. And this became sort of the way things were done in that particular part of the world. The Norman and Anglo-Saxon elements were gradually fused into a national English character, neither predominantly Norman nor Anglo-Saxon, but a subtle blend of both. After losing their own rulers, the Anglo-Saxons adapted to Norman ways. Many found that they could raise their station through the church or through the court and begin to mingle with their Norman overlords. One prominent example is that of Thomas A. Becket, who became Henry II's Lord Chancellor and later Archbishop of Canterbury. So the way you could get more power, which they call raising your station, is you could get power through the church or through the king's court, be one of the king's people that helped administer his power or her power, which later started to happen. Okay. One of the main reasons we're reading this is to find out about the feudal system, land in the feudal system, but this is a new heading, land in the feudal system. So that means at this time, we could go to the notes and put some notes about the Norman conquest in there. So I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, next section, land and the feudal system. Since most of the great Anglo-Saxon landowners were wiped out by the invasion, William had a great deal of land at his disposal. Retaining much himself, the rest he granted to those who had fought faithfully with him. The year 1066 brought the largest change of land ownership in the history of England. William felt that the land of England was his by right of conquest, and that he was free to deed land to his vassals by royal charter, expecting obedience and service in return. Thus, William introduced into England the feudal system as it was practiced on the continent. Okay, so here we go. The feudal system. What the heck is that? Okay, this guy, this king, wiped out all the landowners that were already there. Okay, so he had a whole bunch of land. All right, what's the king going to do with a bunch of land? All right, what he does is he keeps some for himself, and then the rest of them he grants to people who fought for him. And so what he does is he deeds the land or writes it in the law that these people get the land and expects obedience and service from anyone in return who has the land. So each person then owes their service to the king. That's the feudal system. Everybody owes their services to the people above them. Feudalism was a complicated system of landholding. Nobody owned land independently, but only as a vassal of an overlord, who in turn owed allegiance either to some great noble or to the king. The system was really an elaborate chain of loyalties, with rent, so to speak, paid principally in military service to the overlord. The grants William gave were mainly the estates of certain Anglo-Saxons who had died at the conquest. The boundaries of these estates were frequently vague, and the first 20 years Norman rule saw many disputes about property. Therefore, in 1086, William had a complete inventory of all property drawn up in the very important Domesday Book, sometimes called Doomsday by accident, the Book of Judgments. It listed all the landowners and showed the extent of their claims. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a history written by monks hostile to William, says of this great inventory, "It is a shame to tell, though he thought no shame to do it. So very narrowly he caused it to be traced out that there was not one single hide or yard of land, not even an ox, nor a cow, nor a swine, that was not set down in writing." This was an administrative feat without equal any place in Europe. Taxes in England could now be based on real property. Previously, they had been a uniform tax for all. So this is one of the main things that happened during the Norman conquest, is that they established this system where the land was all owned and controlled by the king, and then the king granted it to people who owed him allegiance. I'm going to pause the recording again. I'm going to move on to the medieval church. It sounds like evil, but it's not really. Medieval church. Roughly from the 11th to the 15th century, the people of Western Europe belonged to one homogeneous society with a common culture and a common set of beliefs. The single institution that did the most to promote this unity was the medieval church. This institution crossed physical boundaries and differences in language. Latin, the language of the church, became a language of all educated persons. Despite fierce national loyalty, every person was also responsible to the church, no matter what the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, or free cities people belonged to. They were all also sons and daughters of the church, the Christian Commonwealth of Europe. So even though they all had different countries, you had England, you had France, you had Germany, you had all the countries in Europe, okay, the Danish and all the Scandinavian countries, they all were influenced by the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, which was really the Catholic Church in the beginning, that ended up having power over the people also. So now you have shared power between the kings and the church, which of course caused a problem. The church grew and prospered during the period and continued to be the dominant force in preserving and transmitting culture, in teaching and writing and translating, and in copying, collecting, and distributing manuscripts. It was Europe's chief publisher, librarian, and teacher. Its scholars and philosophers moved freely from university to university and from one country to another. In England, its abbeys and monasteries were not only the main centers of learning and the arts in the period before the founding of Oxford and Cambridge universities in the 13th century, but as economically self-sufficient units, they were often also immense farms, places where all manner of handicrafts were taught and practiced. So here you have the church monasteries as separate farms inside the kingdoms, but they were controlled by the church. So obviously you're going to have a church and kingdom conflict every once in a while. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, next section is medieval life. Most people lived in the country and were attached to a feudal manor. That means that where they lived had this big house in the center of it. There they worked their own fields and lands of the lord of the manor, to whom they owed their allegiance. As the period progressed, however, farming became less important than herding. The wool produced by English sheep was considered preferable to that of almost any other part of Europe. It became profitable, therefore, to turn cornfields into pasture land for sheep. By the end of the 13th century, there were probably as many as 15 or 18 million sheep in England, 4 or 5 for every person. This economic development greatly altered the daily life of the common people. Instead of farmers, many people became herders, but also a large percentage of the population became involved in the wool industry. Cottages became small mills involved in carding and combing, spinning and weaving, some even in dyeing the finished cloth. The common people now paid what they owed their overlords from their wages rather than in farm labor. So this is a major shift that started to happen. But the main thing to remember is that if you lived on some land, you owed your allegiance and somehow some form of taxation to the feudal manor. You owed the duke or the lord or whoever it was, you owed him something. So if you change from farming, where you could give him some corn, to some kind of wool industry, you'd have to give him some wool or somehow maybe you were paid for it. Actually being paid cash makes a big difference rather than having to give him trade. Earlier, some large towns and cities had grown up mainly in the south and related to the court. London is an example, but the widespread production of wool and woolen fabrics and its wide-scale exportation encouraged the growth of cities in the north. More and more people began to live in towns and cities rather than on manors. A whole new class of merchants grew up. A whole group of people who weren't living on a lord's land, but they could still make a living. They called merchants. Many became immensely rich, and through favors to the court, many of them entered the gentry, some even the nobility. Okay, that's the idea of getting yourself a title, as if you had been granted a title by the king and given a bunch of land by the king. So you buy your way in. These populous centers, far from the influence of the French court, developed native forms of literature, songs, and ballads, and native drama with a good deal of color and pageantry. And of course, since this is English class, we're going to be interested in what kind of literature came out of this. The first people to form guilds, societies to regulate prices and standards, were the merchants. Later, the cottage workers also formed guilds to assure fair wages and prices and good standards of material. Okay, and there's a big timeline here right in the middle. And if you follow the timeline, it goes through the initial invasion of William the Conqueror, takes over Norman rule, and then it goes on to the different kings. It goes through what happens, the Norman conquest, and the inventory, the Domesday Book, and the Crusades. The Crusades we're going to get back to. That was where the kings were sending out warriors to kill off other groups. And then Thomas Becket, who was a church leader, he gets murdered, which is a big deal. And then it goes on to the Magna Carta, which maybe you've heard about in history, where the Magna Carta was an agreement where the king had to actually agree and make a deal with the leaders, with the lords, which hadn't been done before. The king could just do whatever he wanted. And then, of course, things started to happen where we got parliament. They got the parliament, and then it tracks a bunch of the other literature, which maybe we'll get to. Here's a picture of a castle. So, of course, the person owning all the land would live in this castle. And slowly but surely, the castle walls would start to incorporate some of the houses around it. People would want to be near the castle for protection. And the castle would actually grow and turn into into a town. Okay, I got to keep with the reading, which left off with what words? The guilds got good standards of material and workmanship. The guild system encouraged a kind of extended family life. A master dyer would often have living with him several apprentices and also journeyman men who had passed their apprenticeship and were training to be masters themselves. Okay, here one of the things that's noticeable is that the master would have people living with him. When you think about it, back in those days, you needed a place to live. If you lived on a lord's land, you owed the lord some taxes. So you had to live somewhere. So if you lived with a master dyer, you would then owe him your work. And that would be just one way of surviving, getting some food and some place to live. With prosperity and simultaneous growth in population, the English turned to other kinds of work. This is the period of the great English cathedrals, Winchester and Lincoln cathedrals, Salisbury and Durham. It's hard to believe that the labor that went into the construction of these cathedrals, often over a period of several hundred years. York's Minster was begun as a Norman church in 1070 and was not completed until 1472. Guilds were founded for many of these workers: stone cutters and masons, carpenters and wood carvers, glass blowers and stainers. Much of the communal life of the city centers around these magnificent monuments, where, among other things, the first English dramas were performed. So here we are talking about English teachery stuff, because plays, English dramas, were performed. Say it again. English dramas were performed in these cathedrals. I have 3 minutes left before the end of the period and enough to finish this paragraph. Life in the Middle Ages was austere in many ways. There were few of the comforts and conveniences we take for granted. Travel was difficult and often dangerous. Food, lacking sugar and potatoes and many other things, even for the rich, probably offered little variety. Since there was no way to preserve or refrigerate food, sometimes a lot had to be eaten quickly while it was in season. Winters brought a very limited and unwholesome diet for most people. The countryside, however, and to some extent the towns, were probably fresh, colorful, and beautiful without the smoke of modern industrial factories. Also, the dress of the period seems to have been bright and varied, as evidenced by the paintings of the time. Great lords in sumptuous attire and their retinues in colorful livery, even the guild members in clothing characteristic of their trades. I'm going to underline a couple of things. Life being austere, saying that they don't have comforts and conveniences, talking about travel being difficult, food being boring, little variety. There was no way to preserve or refrigerate food. That's why we have feasts, by the way, to get rid of all the food. So Thanksgiving is because all the food just came in. What are you supposed to do with, I don't know, lettuce or beans or something? How do you preserve them? So in the winter, all you were eating was salted meat and potatoes that had been put in someone's basement.